Include you at the panels.
Yeah, but don't introduce.
Okay.
I just want to make a couple of remarks about the census before we actually move into redistricting.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, so welcome everyone. My name's Mike Ignatowski. I'm a board member on Common Ground for Texans. And I'm happy to introduce the topic for today, which is, in general, gerrymandering. Now, many people will consider this plus money in politics to be the two biggest problems in our democracy right now. And gerrymandering itself is coming to kind of a climax here in interest between a number of court cases filtering through the system and the upcoming 2020 census, which will end up being used to redraw a lot of the districts. There's a tremendous amount of interest in this, tremendous amount of activity happening here. So it's a very timely that we have this discussion here. We have three excellent panelists. I'll introduce them more in a minute, but basically Michael Sarahan is a software engineer working on maps for gerrymandering. Stephanie Swanson, League of Women Voters, and David Jones from Clean Election Texas, who's going to explain all this stuff about court cases behind me. The format is as usual. We'll give each of these about 10-15 minutes to do a general overview and some educational material for the group. Joanne gets, what do you want, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
And I guess the reason for the 2 minutes is we normally think of the census in terms of reapportionment and drawing districts. But the other part of that is that a lot of the redistribution of federal funds also is linked to the census. So if we have a large undercount population, it means that the apportionment of funds decreases. And I think many people may not appreciate that aspect of the census. So that's one of the things that we'll be talking about at the workshop. Thanks.
But that wasn't your 2 minutes, or was it?
That's my 2 minutes.
The good thing, because that was close.
So after we do the background presentations, we'll go into the question and answer sessions from the audience, and I'll introduce how that happens. So our second panelist for today, we're going to start with Stephanie, right?
Yes.
Stephanie Swanson from the League of Women Voters. Stephanie's career started in academia, where she helped manage multidisciplinary laboratory, Department of Biochemistry at Texas A&M. Last spring, she helped organize a group called De-Gerrymandering Texas and started giving talks on redistricting reform around the state. She became the issue chair of redistricting for the League of Women Voters. And she helped start the Fair Maps Texas Coalition, and she's here to tell us more about that today. So, Stephanie.
So all of us, I think, on the panel are with Fair Maps. Joanne's with Fair Maps. Common Ground is with Fair Maps. There's a lot of familiar faces here, and I think a lot of you guys could probably be up here talking for me at this point. So we have a good start. We're making a good effort, so I'm very excited to be here to tell you about it today. So since I'm with the League, I always have to start every talk that I give with this general stance. We are nonpartisan. We never support or oppose parties or candidates. Our mission is to educate, inform, and advocate. And it's always good, in my opinion, to start with what the League wants. So there's no confusion about where we stand. I'm going to just literally read it off the screen. The League of Women Voters firmly believes that the responsibility of redistricting should be vested in an independent special commission with membership that reflects the diversity of the unit of government, including citizens at large, representative of public interest groups, and members of minority groups. We need to be working with our communities so that our representation is reflective of our communities. So mainly we want to take the power of redistricting away from the legislator who has a self-vested interest in the way the maps are drawn. So we have certain expectations for our vote. We expect our elections to be fair, our votes to count equally, our voices to be heard. Our country we're founded on democratic principles after all. We want our legislators we want to be able to hold them accountable through the power of our vote. And right now we can't do that. We can't vote them out of office. They've drawn themselves safe districts. The only place we can hold them accountable is in the primary. So now you've narrowed down the field of people that can vote these people out of office to a few percent of the population. I think it varies from 5 to 10% of the general population that gets to choose sort of who these elected officials are. And of course, we want them to represent all of us. But like I said, this isn't possible right now, and that's because of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the practice of drawing district lines to favor one group of people over another. And in Texas, we have it really bad. We have two types of gerrymandering, and we have a very long history of it. So not only do we have racial gerrymandering, where they draw the districts to infringe on the rights of a minority population, we also have partisan gerrymandering. And what's happened over the past 20 years is that these lines between partisan and racial gerrymandering have crossed. So now what you have is maps that are drawn with partisan intent, infringing on the rights of minority groups, and that's a really tough point to be talking about here, because we have to win over not only minority groups, we have to win back their trust, we also have to win back the whole spectrum of the political field basically as well. Another point to bring up is that if we want to bring about change, we most likely are going to have a state constitutional amendment, and that's very difficult to get through. Other states that have passed reform, California, Arizona, they have available to them ballot measures or initiatives. We don't have that here in Texas, so we have our work cut out for us, indeed. And then I want to emphasize really quick why do we need districts to begin with? And I have a nice video, which you probably won't be able to see very clearly. No, you can't. So as our state grows and cities are built, the population changes. People move from one city to another, from one state to another. So you have this shift basically in our demographics. And Texas is a very large state. The needs of people on the coast are going to be very different from the needs of the people out in El Paso. And we have many, many different regions. So they're all unique communities. They all have their own unique needs. And we refer to this as communities of interest. So I want you to think, for example, of how a town out in West Texas started to begin with. Probably they came around the railroad, or there was a company that came out and started up now. You need certain things in order to be able to start a town. You need a water supply, infrastructure. So those are all the common needs, and that's why you need a district, because all of those people in that community share the exact same needs, basically. I'm going to skip this part about the legislator. And I would like to go ahead and show you some of the districts so you guys really appreciate some of these communities of interest the legislator has currently drawn for us. And I definitely want to show this cartoon. So, you know, when you think of different regions of Texas, you would expect to hopefully have a map that looks like this. Nice, even, geometrically shaped, somewhat districts. But really, in reality, that's not what's occurring. You have maps that look similar to this, or more like monsters. So I would like to show you some of the horrible examples from Texas. So here's TX 27. This is Blake Farenthold's district currently. I just want to point out that I think Corpus Christi and Austin are about 6 hours away from one another. So you can imagine the people along the coastline are going to have incredibly different needs than the people out in Bastrop and on the west side of Austin. Take, for example, the hurricane that came through. Those people are going to be incredibly worried about the insurance legislation that went through last session. Austin, we're going to be more worried about our water supply, so it's completely different, opposite needs of the spectrum. This one is my parents' district in Houston. They're up in Kingwood, up on the northeast side of town. This one's currently held by Ted Poe. This one I think is my least favorite. It stresses me out when I see this. I'm like, oh God, why? And then this one is the infamous one. This is TX35. Unfortunately, it's right here in Austin. This is held by Lloyd Doggett. Lincoln, I think. Anyways, Lloyd Doggett. This is at the forefront of our current gerrymandering case that Dave will be talking about in a few minutes. So I just wanted to point out that the judges in the case did deem this to be a racial gerrymander. They stated that the state drew this because the state, when they originally drew it, said that it was supposed to be a new majority-minority district. They drew it to give these people a voice. Not sure I can agree with that when it goes from Austin to San Antonio. So just think about what a community of interest is one more time, and I guess you can think that maybe the fact that they live along 35 could be the reason that they're together, but it's not. That's not good reasons.
Well, at one point it went all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley, so it's a little bit better than it was.
The Supreme Court overturned that. I think it was in 2006, and they threw the reason in there. They said, you claim you drew this to give more representation to people, but I have to disagree with you because that district runs for 300 miles or something like that, so it's hard to imagine. I also wanted to point out that these maps are drawn with a lot of technology, and Mike will be able to explain more of the math behind some of it in just a bit. This is just a picture of San Marcos, so I want you to be familiar with how precise these maps can be. They go down to the block level. And now I'm going to tell you about, so what is the whole point of gerrymandering? Basically, what does this translate into? Does one party have an advantage? So in the 90s, it was the Democrats who gerrymandered against the Republicans. And you can see here that the vote was split pretty evenly. However, Democrats had 70% of the seats. And then in 2016, it's the opposite. Republicans captured 56% of the votes, but they have 70% of the seats. And I do want to go over this because this is really important. This is really the crux of what we are trying to fix, basically. So legislators have drawn themselves safe districts. So importantly, we cannot hold them accountable to the power of our vote. We have to go to the primaries to vote them out. When you move the election to the primary, no compromising occurs across party lines anymore. What happens is you have to then appeal to a broader base within your party. So now you're going to the extremes to capture that vote. And so this leads to polarization of the parties. Also, you have a problem with incumbents getting reelected and this skewing the election, basically. It's hard to find challengers. And races go uncontested, and this leads to no choice at the ballot box. And then, if I can find it, I'm sorry. So I'm here to actually tell you about Fair Maps. So all of these nonprofits are working on redistricting. So this is our attempt to unify our efforts. So right now we have the League of Women Voters, we have Clean Elections, we have Common Grounds, we have Common Cause, we have the ACLU of Texas, and we are growing. We have the Texas Civil Rights Projects as well. This is our attempt, like I said, to get everyone's efforts unified, and we have a few ideas that we would like to start working on. Number one is we want to educate the public, and I have comments that were prepared by the president of the National League, and I'll read that to you in just a second. But mainly her point is that we want to educate the public. We want to be around, we want to monitor the process of redistricting when the maps are drawn. That is very crucial. And then we want to be able to pass local resolutions. It's important for us to talk to our neighbors, to talk to our friends about redistricting, but it's also important to be talking to our local elected officials. It's one thing if we call our legislators, it's worth 100 phone calls of us if we get an elected official to do it. So we need to start building more of a collective voice from the community. And then we also like to create maps, and this is something that we're just beginning to work on. Mike Sarahan can tell you about some of the math behind it too in just a minute. We have Harriet Harrow here. Harriet actually wrote this guide. She's a member of the Austin Independent Redistricting Commission, so this is a fantastic resource. If you guys want to learn more about the process of how Austin did it, beautiful, beautiful report. But basically what I wanted to emphasize is we want to work with our communities, and that's exactly what the Austin Independent Redistricting Commission did. They actually held public hearings. They went into every part of the town basically and got public input and feedback, and it was quite a process. This is just pointing out 35. Let me read you Chris Carson's comments. So like I said, Chris is the president of the National League, and so she just wrote some comments to maybe entice you guys to come and work with us. Let me see. There's a whole component of citizen education dealing with transparency and public engagement that is absolutely vital to any redistricting system. People need to understand what the current redistricting process is, why it's so bad, and what can be done about it in clear, simple terms. We need good material in all formats and good speakers to share that material. Texas is a very diverse state. One format does not fit all. We need volunteers to represent that diversity to help us inform the public. Importantly, we need to focus on creating a more transparent process. We need people to watch when the new maps are drawn to guard against gerrymandering. Sunlight disinfects. If the line drawers aren't doing anything funny, then there's no reason to be doing this behind closed doors. The public needs to see and understand who is drawing the maps and how they are drawn. So that's basically about it. Oh, here's our website. We will have an action toolbox out within the next week to give you guys ideas if you want to look at a local resolution to see what that would look like and the steps to take to get one passed. That will be available, and we'll have other ideas out there to share in the action toolkit as well. So.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. A quick question. You mentioned state constitution amendment may eventually be needed. Is that part of what Fairmap is working on, or is that too long term?
So I think this upcoming session, we will be supporting one. So there's a bunch of ideas we have for legislation right now. So for to get an independent redistricting commission set up for the state legislator, we would need a state constitutional amendment to get passed. However, one of the tricks that we have up our sleeves is that you can set up an IRC for federal districts, so for U.S. congressional districts, and you would just need a regular state statute to get that passed. And in fact, State Senator Jeff Wentworth almost got that passed in 07, 09, and 11. It was very close. It was a bipartisan citizens commission. However, I think Tom Craddock was Speaker of the House at the time, and he didn't want it to go through. But one more thing, really quick. Next session, I think we were going to be shooting, like lowering the bar a bit, and not only supporting the state constitutional amendment and an IRC for federal districts, but I think importantly, we would like to see there be public hearings with public input after the census data comes down. So right now, they have public field hearings, but that's before the census data is passed out, so we're not quite sure what the point of those are. So that's the bill that we'd be supporting for next session.
So you do have legislative goals the next session, which is before the census. Okay, thank you. You want to get Michael set up here? So a little bit more background. Michael Sarahan is a software engineer for Anaconda. He's working on open source data science tools. After the 2016 election, Michael saw gerrymandering as a good way to apply his computing skills to political problems. He attended the Tufts Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering conference in last July back in Boston, and where he learned a lot more about this problem. He has participated in hackathons and simulations for gerrymandering, and the results of those simulations were actually used in the recent Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision. Maybe you could tell us about that. He recently became the open source coordinator for the Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering group, which is a small Boston team of mathematicians at Tufts dedicated to studying and fighting gerrymandering. Michael.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk, sorry Stephanie, I'm not going to talk about drawing maps. Mostly I'm going to talk about analyzing maps and knowing when people are cheating. Because that's kind of the game that seems to be playing the most in the courts right now. It's to say, how do you get the maps that people are proposing and say, nope, sorry, that one's not going to fly for this reason. And so some of the reasons people talk about is geometry. Some of them are different other mathematical measures, and I'll talk about what those other math measures are. You can come up with like zillions of analytical measures. And so the name of this game really, to me, is not which one are you going to win with, but what body of evidence in aggregate can you present to say this set of districts is wrong for these reasons. So as far as shape goes, there's a ton of different measures. None of them have been successful in convincing the court about gerrymandering. But the real reason is that there's a lot of good, legitimate reasons to have squirrely shapes. And so this one is in Arizona, I think, and it's drawn to connect Indian tribes. You got one in Illinois, the earmuffs. That one's famous. That's to connect two different communities. The bottom one I think is Hispanic, and this one's Puerto Rican. And so the two communities are too small to have a district unto themselves, but if you connect them, you've got a majority-minority district. So the story is complicated, and it's especially complicated to catch when people are talking about like, oh, I'm doing this for the right reasons. And it's like, really? So let's talk more about the different metrics. So efficiency gap is a partisan gerrymandering metric. And what it's a metric of is to say there's this notion of a wasted vote. And a wasted vote is one that didn't really effectively count. And so anything on the winning side beyond the 50% plus one that you need to win is wasted. And on the losing side, all of them are wasted. So if you do well, you do the math here, you end up with an efficiency gap of 0. Right? So that's a totally ideal situation. And what that means is that you have the same number of wasted votes on both sides. Right? That's the ideal situation. So when you use that, you can kind of analyze and say, how many extra seats did people get that they really shouldn't have gotten because there were too many wasted votes? And so this is kind of an analysis of that, I think from 2016 election. I'm not sure where exactly they got that, but you see North Carolina, very, very gerrymandered. Pennsylvania, they're getting 3 extra seats because of their gerrymander, more than they really should, based on the efficiency gap metric. One of the coolest things I learned from the conference is that there is a competition of concerns between truly representational elections, like proportional representation, and how competitive your elections are, how easy it is to swing your election one way or the other. And so what this represents is on the bottom you got the percent of total votes, and if you get exactly the representation, the seats, for your percentage of votes, that is proportional representation, right? That's actually really hard to swing elections one way or the other. So if you've got like more than 5% majority, for all intents and purposes, you're never going to swing that district. So that's where it becomes more interesting to say, can you tweak your curve there for how your seats go, and changing the outcome of the election just a little bit, the vote, like getting more people out to vote, will have more of an effect. And so what the efficiency gap is doing is making an implicit assumption of kind of a sigmoid curve there with a coefficient of 2. Right? So it's not proportional representation. We do tend to prefer competitive elections over simply representative elections. You guys may have read articles about computers drawing districts. Steph had one pictured like this. I would say, please don't. Sorry, Steph. But really, the reason why is because if it's a computer program drawing it, everybody's initial idea is, oh, computers are not biased. And that's just simply not true, right? The computers have the same bias as whoever programmed the computers. So it gets right back to the political process of saying who's in charge of telling a computer what to do. But it's also just simply really, really hard. So it's easy for a certain number of inputs, but if you take a look at the combinatoric space of how many little subunits you have in terms of VTDs and all that other stuff, there's practically infinite number of ways you can draw districts. So it's not an entirely tractable problem. This guy, Justin Solomon, is one of the MGGG people. He's at MIT. He's a computer science, electrical engineering nerd. That's a very good talk if you guys are curious to learn more about that. So where I would really recommend using computing is in democratizing map drawing and also giving people the power to analyze maps and say, nope, that one's not fair. And so that's what I'm working on with MGGG, is to create a bunch of open source tools that give not only math experts who are fighting court cases very fast answers, but also perhaps one day communities to look at maps when Stephanie calls out these legislators to say, hey, show us your maps, let's talk about them. I want to be able to empower people to analyze those maps and say, nope, not going to fly. Or at least try to do that, because legislators tend to do whatever they want anyway. So Pennsylvania, what did I do there? Pennsylvania, you guys may know the case. Vote percentage in Pennsylvania is roughly 50-50. Out of 50 House Congress seats, Democrats have 5. Something's not right there. The state Supreme Court threw out the Republican districts and said, you guys have 3 weeks to draw new ones. The Republicans said, how about not? We'll just appeal it to the Supreme Court. And David will talk more about that. I think Samuel Alito kicked it back down. Republicans complain now about not having enough time. It's like, well, you did before. But anyway, they published a new map proposal. And so this is right where I got involved. I had been to a hackathon. Lou Duchesne, the leader of MGGG, mathematician, called me up and said, my programmer dropped out. Can you help? And I said, sure, I'll try. So they had published this map. And we set off, they'd also published these analysis statistics. And you guys probably can't read here, but what I'll point out is absolutely every one of the statistics they pointed to were geometric. They didn't publish any partisan metrics at all. They kind of swept those under the rug. So this is just a graphical thing, and a lot of how you win court cases is by showing in context where is some preponderance of simulated plans that follow the characteristics you say you're following. And if your new plan sits in that preponderance, you're pretty good. It means you're following the constraints that you say you are. Whereas if you're not, this was the original plan, the court basically says it's fishy. And that's how things get thrown out. So, Moon and I did that analysis with a few of the other participants from the hackathon, and we came up with the partisan metrics that said, no, I'm sorry, still pretty heavily biased. We fed that to Governor Wolf's team. He rejected it. Republicans now want to impeach the state Supreme Court justices. Yeah, it's anarchy, or smells of anarchy. Ultimately, Governor Wolf proposed the new map. We analyzed this one too. And the way that we analyzed this one was the same way we analyzed the Republican one. It's this fancy name called a Markov chain Monte Carlo. And all that means is it's a bunch of random numbers. And we start with the initial districts, and we toggle those VTDs in and out of different districts, right? Move the boundary just a little bit.
What's VTD?
VTD is a voter tabulation district. It's kind of the fundamental lowest level block that doesn't get split when you're drawing districts. So you control kind of how that thing meanders through time based on your criteria for what a good map is. And at each different step, you're going to compute these statistics. And so what you come up with is a histogram, a big drawing of how those things look. So these are the histograms that went into the Pennsylvania case. And what you see here this is the new Republican plan, this is the current Republican plan. They're both way outside the vast preponderance of the simulated districts. So we did 1 billion simulations for each of these different histograms. And this gave us good confidence to say the governor's plan is probably not partisan gerrymandered, whereas the Republican plan absolutely is.
Is that the second Republican plan? I mean, after that's the one that's...
This is the second one.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. Thanks. Okay, so the end result is the court didn't end up using Governor Wolf's plan. I don't know exactly what plan the court did use, where they got their values from, but it was certainly a very interesting thing to take part in. One of the coolest ideas I've heard of how to draw fair districts is this whole I cut, you choose thing that you do with kids, right? So it's like you got a piece of cake. What do kids want to do? They want the biggest possible piece, right? So you let one kid cut and you let the other kid choose. They will do fairly. And it's actually been mathematically proven. So cool idea. And kind of, that's the only time I've actually been happy that we have a two-party system here. It's because something like that idea would work. In Texas, David's probably going to talk a lot more about this, but the major kicker is that they're claiming that, oh, we didn't draw maps for racial reasons, we drew them for partisan reasons. And the partisan claims against that got dismissed. So it's really a test of did they do it for partisan reasons or did they do it for race? If they did it for race, they're certainly in trouble. This is a tool that uses statistics. It's called ecological inference, and it's a way of predicting the probability of how many people in that given district are a given minority, and which way did they vote. So it's a way of associating those two things, race and the probability of voting in a partisan way, and hopefully this is going to help them nail that case and say, no, you guys really did the wrong thing. So, yeah, we'll talk more about this in the panel, but my main take-home point is computers can do some incredibly useful things for us, but they're not the answer. They're not a panacea, and they're a tool that are going to help us in our conversations. They're going to give us a lot of data in our conversations, but we do have to take care with them. And we should definitely kill gerrymandering. So thanks.
Just want to add one thing to what you said, and that is that efficiency gap, you're going to hear about efficiency gap a lot because of the various court cases. And I'm a visual person, so I can't read words to figure out what the efficiency gap is. So I've put together a table and an illustration of how you calculate what an efficiency gap is. The Brennan Center has a wonderful sort of one-pager that does that. I'll put it on our website, and I have a handout on the back. So go pick it up, because you'll hear about it a lot.
Yeah, people are really curious about that. I did compute the efficiency gap for Texas. So
I just want to point out that the efficiency gap is very complicated to compute for Texas because we have so many uncontested races in the House. So 54%, how many were there? 54%, I think, of the state house were uncontested. So then you have to deal with...
That makes it look artificially low.
Well, have you lost half your data, right?
Right.
So if you calculate it, just omitting that data, what do you get for the efficiency gap?
I don't think they can hear you in the back.
You get 9% as the efficiency gap for that, and that's actually quite a bit lower than it really is. It's quite a bit lower than Pennsylvania.
I mean, that's because it's a red state, right? I mean, basically. I mean, it's dominated by, and it's not as competitive.
Right.
Okay. We'll have plenty of time for questions later. Thanks, Michael. I want to move on to our third panelist here, or fourth panelist, depending on how you count. David Jones from Clean Election, Texas. He's a civil trial lawyer practicing in Dallas, and he drove all the way here from Dallas this morning. Thank you, David.
Bribed him with lunch.
It was an excellent lunch, too.
Last 7 years, he's been devoting time to public interest organizing, educating, and lobbying. Currently, he's president of Clean Election Texas. It's a nonprofit, citizen-based organization working on campaign finance reform, ethics, and voter rights issues. David, and your whiteboard.
Yeah, I'm not electronic, but hi, thank you all for inviting me to come down here.
I'm actually moving out of your way here.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. So that's the only graphic I have, and I don't have an electronic. I appreciate you coming. I want to go through the Supreme Court cases that are relevant right now. But before I do that, just from listening to the talk, one of the things that occurred to me, and I don't know how sophisticated you all are in all this, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but everybody needs to understand that there's currently really only one kind of gerrymandering that is unconstitutional, and that is a racial gerrymandering. A lot of the discussion as far as the statistics and so forth has to do with calculating what might constitute a partisan gerrymandering. And these cases that I'm going to talk about primarily today involve the issue of partisan gerrymandering. But so far, the Supreme Court has not said that a partisan gerrymander is unconstitutional. And so you just got to keep that distinction first in your mind between states that are racially gerrymandered, which Texas has been traditionally, and that's the basis for the Abbott versus Perez case that's up in front of the United States Supreme Court right now, involving the state of Texas primarily, because the small attempt that was made in Texas to try to prove partisan gerrymandering was dismissed by the district court, and they tried to appeal that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court didn't accept that part of the appeal either. So Texas is purely a racial gerrymander at this point. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was clear before I get into some of these other cases, because, yeah.
I guess I could clarify just a tiny bit. The Supreme Court has said that political gerrymandering is justiciable, but there is no standard they will accept so far for measuring it. So they've left it open to rule on in the future, but they haven't outright said it won't happen.
Define justiciable.
They will take a case. Well, David knows much better, but
Well, yeah, I mean, justiciable just means that the court can consider it, but they've gone a little bit farther than that, and that is that the court has indicated that it's possible that there could be partisan gerrymandering, and that could violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And perhaps the First Amendment as well. But the current state of the law is a couple of cases primarily decided because of Justice Kennedy, a split court, that the Justice Kennedy primarily has said there's an unworkable standard, that they don't see anything that's judicially manageable to try to determine what might constitute a partisan gerrymander. And that's sort of what brings us to all these cases that are currently pending. And just a little bit more on racial gerrymander. Racial gerrymander is usually based on the Constitution. It requires proof of either an intent to discriminate and then a discriminatory effect. A lot of times it's based also on the Voting Rights Act, and the Texas case falls into that category. And there's sort of different elements of proof in a racial gerrymandering than what's necessary to prove, or may be necessary to prove, a partisan gerrymander. Anyway, since we're talking about the Texas case, just to fill you in on where that is, I mean, the Texas case, the court has decided that both the district court in San Antonio has decided that both the congressional maps in Texas and the state legislative maps in Texas are racial gerrymanders, and both as to 2011 maps that they initially considered, and then the legislature had another shot at it in 2013. And in 2013, the district court in San Antonio found that those were, the 2013 maps were racial gerrymander also. The state of Texas has appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The court has stayed any further action in the district court in San Antonio on the Texas case. And it's before the United States Supreme Court. I think it hasn't been actually set for oral argument at this point, but April 24th, is it? I knew it was thought that they were thinking it'd be in April, but I didn't know there was a specific date. Okay, there you go. Maybe I should sit down. And I tell you what, I've worked with Stephanie on the Fair Maps group, and she is just a jewel, man. She does everything, and she knows a lot about this issue. So
do you expect a ruling this year on that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's pretty late in the term. I think that there's, I mean, April 24th argument is clearly possible, and that they would rule on something. But it's hard to know what they'll do. I mean, they may send it back down. There's a lot of different possibilities there still, and I don't really care to speculate on that because I think it's really hard to tell. There's some issues that I won't get into about that because of the 2013 redo may make it a little more complicated for the plaintiffs to pursue the Texas case. Anyway, let me go on in the time that I have because I want to kind of go through these cases. What's happened is that thanks to a lot of really good evidence that's been developed by folks like Michael and others in the academic community, there's a lot of proof available now to try to determine what might constitute a partisan gerrymander. And a lot of this academic proof was sort of developed in a way as a response to the concerns that Justice Kennedy had about the fact that there wasn't really a workable or judicially manageable standard to determine what might constitute a partisan gerrymander. And so these cases that are coming towards the Supreme Court, one of them's already been argued, have ways to try to get around that. They're slightly different. There are ways to prove what might constitute an extreme partisan gerrymandering. The court has made it clear in the past that some expectation of partisanship in the redistricting process is to be anticipated. These are political units that do this. I mean, the legislatures typically do it, and that's to be expected. So the key is to determine what might be enough of a partisan gerrymander to make it something that would be unconstitutional. And the first case is out of Wisconsin. It's Gill versus Whitford, and it involved the state legislative districts in Wisconsin, and a contest that was brought in federal court there to try to overturn the redistricting that was done there in 2011. And I mean, it was an incredible process. I mean, the Republicans in Wisconsin basically gathered in this lawyer's office off to the side of where the legislature was, and they all kind of figured out what maps were the best for them. And those are the maps that they draw, and they drew the best ones that they could with the most partisan advantage. And that the proof in the case is really pretty compelling about that they did that intentionally, and that it had a discriminatory effect on Democrats in the state. And Michael already mentioned the fact that there's a majority, the state votes majority Democratic, and then I think it's 60 of the 99 assembly seats were won by Republicans. So they definitely established a good partisan advantage in the gerrymandering that they did. Anyway, that case has been filed. The district court, the three-judge district court, decided that it was indeed a partisan gerrymandering, which was a pretty big step out there for a district court to say, since the United States Supreme Court hadn't really said that's what could be, that there could be a partisan gerrymander. And it did it on the basis of really a test that I think is really creative, that was established by folks at the Campaign Legal Center in Washington, D.C. Primarily, the legal aspects of it were, although it was assisted hugely by all the scientific evidence, the academic evidence that exists. And they argued, the plaintiffs in that case argued that basically this was a denial of the equal protection rights of the Democrats in Wisconsin, that it diluted their actual voting strength in a way that deprived them of their representational rights and voting strength, appropriate voting strength under the 14th Amendment. And then they also argued that it was a violation of the First Amendment because it unduly burdened their speech and association rights by basically damaging the associational and speech rights of Democrats just because they didn't support Republicans, and so they were thrown into districts where they didn't have a chance to succeed. I don't want to get too far into the details, but it kind of matters because of the Vinisek case that I'll tell you in just a second. That the Gill versus Whitford test requires a showing of an intent to discriminate, and then that there was an actual discriminatory effect, which is sort of similar to what happens in racial gerrymandering cases. And then that there's no reasonable basis to account for that. And the burden is on the plaintiffs who bring the case at first to prove that there's a discriminatory intent and that there's a discriminatory effect. And if they do that, then the burden shifts to the defendant to try to show that there might be some reasonable basis. And it's sort of a middle ground approach, and it actually, thanks largely to some of the statistical evidence that Michael talked about, there's an ability to have that kind of a test apply over a wide range of cases in a lot of different situations, but mostly in a situation where there would be an extreme gerrymander and not in just every single case where there's some slight partisan advantage. And what the court has been very concerned about in the past is that they could open the floodgates to litigation every time there's some partisan advantage, but that there should be some standard where there's extreme gerrymandering that would be enough to be unconstitutional. That case was argued back in October and is currently pending for the United States Supreme Court, and it's Gill versus Whitford, and it's supposed to be, everybody feels like it'll be decided by June. That's the end of this court's term. Meanwhile, the Vinisek case in Maryland was proceeding, and that case involves a Democratic gerrymander. And what happened in that case is that the legislature in Maryland, the democratically controlled legislature in Maryland, flipped a district, the 6th congressional district in Maryland, and changed it from Republican to Democratic by gerrymandering, and basically dumping Republicans out and Democrats pulling the Democrats in, and the Republicans that have brought that lawsuit, citizens there in Maryland, have claimed that that's partisan gerrymander and a denial of equal protection. They really did not succeed in the trial court, but there's an appeal, and on appeal the Supreme Court has now accepted the appeal, and the Vinisek case is scheduled to be argued, I think, at the end of March, March 28th. So it's coming up, and it's interesting that the court accepted this case. The proof in the Vinisek case is that it was a violation of the First Amendment only, and it's sort of a different legal theory than the theory that is in Gill versus Whitford. It's based purely on the fact that the district was flipped, and that it was flipped intentionally as a result of the desire of the Democrats to retaliate. The allegations in the case are they retaliate against the Republicans in that district, and that retaliation had the effect of discriminating against the Republican voters in that district. And I mean, I don't want to get too technical about this, and we'll see how much it matters. But in the end, what it means is that there's sort of two different theories that are in front of the United States Supreme Court through the Gill versus Whitford case and the Vinisek case. And there's arguments both ways for which is a better test. I have my own opinions about it, and I think that if you try to objectively look at the analysis, I think that the theory of the plaintiffs in Gill is a much better theory because it's just more broadly applicable. And there's actually a really excellent brief that the Campaign Legal Center and some other folks filed in the Benesek case describing how the Gill standard would result in a more fair determination over the entire differences of different fact situations than the Benesek case would, as far as determining what might constitute a partisan gerrymander. The Campaign Legal Center isn't arguing against the plaintiffs in that brief. They think that yes, this clearly was a partisan gerrymander in Maryland, and had a discriminatory effect on their speech, and it was retaliation. But they're just saying it's just kind of interesting that there's going to be two different theories argued in front of the United States Supreme Court, and it'll be interesting to see what the court does with that. It could accept both of them. It can do whatever it wants. It may not accept any of them. Anyway, that case is the Benesek case is set to be argued at the end of March, and we'll see. It'll probably be a decision by the end of this term as well. The next two cases, really, they got combined at the district court level, comes out of North Carolina, and it's called Rucho versus the League of Women Voters. And then there was another case filed by folks at Common Cause called Rucho versus Common Cause, and those cases got consolidated. And the League of Women Voters in that case was represented by the Campaign Legal Center again, and presented lots of evidence at the trial of that case about the types of partisan asymmetry and some of the measures that Michael was talking about, and really laid an excellent groundwork, similar to what they had done in Gill versus Whitford, to show how there can be a workable standard to determine what might constitute a partisan gerrymander. And they won that case in the district court. The defendants appealed. Rucho he's the head of the state Senate Redistricting Committee in North Carolina. The facts in the Rucho case are just even more outrageous than the Wisconsin case. In fact, they were, I mean, in North Carolina is an incredible place, actually. It's almost as bad as Texas. Maybe worse, actually. I mean, they were just like, we drew these districts because we wanted more Republicans to win than Democrats. If we could have drawn them so that they were 11-1 for Republicans, and I forget the exact numbers, we would have, but we couldn't figure out how to do that, so we drew them at 10-2. I mean, and that's just, those are admissions that they made. And so there's plenty of evidence. And in the Rucho case, the league pursued the same legal theories that I was describing to you in Gill versus Woodford, the equal protection argument and First Amendment argument with an intent and an effect test, and then without any reasonable explanation. Am I getting too much in the details here? Okay. Anyway, the Common Cause has a slightly different argument. They have a slightly different test. It comes to the same result, but it offers a slightly different way of doing it, and requires a showing that there's a compelling state interest to do changes in the maps, and that brings forward the constitutional claims. The court found, the district court there found that basically the intent and effect test applied, but that there was also a violation of Article 1 of the Constitution, which requires representation, and that was one of the theories that the Common Cause folks brought forward as well. So that case was successful at the district court. They've appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and it's been stayed. In that case, the United States Supreme Court has stayed any further appeal on the Rucho case until the Guilford versus Whitford and the Benesek case are determined. It didn't specify, but they're stayed until those cases are resolved effectively. Yes, ma'am.
Just out of curiosity, in the Benesek case, if it's determined that it was done in retaliation and the court accepted that, then does that mean that what they are retaliating against can be admitted as evidence of the opposite? Is that clear enough?
I'm not sure I'm clear. It's probably, may not be understanding you.
I'm just asking whether, if you said the Democrats brought the case, if they did what they did as a retaliation for something, and that's determined by the court, does that mean that the previous gerrymander can then be adjudicated as well?
It's actually the other way around. In Maryland, in the Benesek case, it was the Democrats that gerrymandered.
That's what I mean. But can they, if it's in retaliation for something the Republicans did, then can the court also sit in judgment on the previous Republican gerrymander for which they retaliated?
The Republicans are claiming the Democrats retaliated against them by pouring them out of that district. And maybe we're just not communicating.
Yeah, we'll handle it afterwards.
Yeah. It could be unconstitutional based on the retaliation if it causes discrimination in their First Amendment rights. If it unduly burdens their First Amendment right.
So why they retaliated? Was it because of the Republicans?
I don't want to get too hung up on the fact that it's a retaliation, because I think the retaliation is just an allegation that sort of they crafted the Republican plaintiffs in that case crafted the retaliation issue based on some previous United States Supreme Court cases that had said that retaliation in a First Amendment context can be a basis for a claim of discrimination. If that makes any sense. And so it's really just sort of a legal, I don't want to say it's a legal formality because it's more than that, but it's really just a way to present the First Amendment claim. Because and this is, in my view, the limitation of the Benesek case is that it looks at what the status quo was in that particular district, and it only looks at that particular district and the fact that that district got flipped. It doesn't look at all the districts in Maryland. And when you think about it, any flipping of any district really changes the whole thing for the whole state in some way. I mean, there is a statewide impact. And that's actually the argument that goes against the theory that was used in the Benesek case by the plaintiffs, and that is that a lot of times districts get flipped for reasons that aren't really a partisan gerrymander, or for any reason. When a redistricting occurs, sometimes just because to preserve the continuity of the entire state, all the maps get jumbled around. Sometimes one district gets flipped from Democrat to Republican, but the other gets flipped from Republican to Democrat. And so that's a limitation of that test, but there definitely was proof that they intended to throw the Republicans out of that district.
I'm just asking whether there was an automatic scrutiny.
Please handle it later.
Yeah.
Any other key points you want to make?
You want to say anything about the Pennsylvania case?
Yeah, let me quickly go to the last case, which is the Pennsylvania case, and Michael did a great job describing what he's been helping with there. The Pennsylvania case is different because it's brought in state court, and all these other cases are federal court cases. And it's based on the Pennsylvania Constitution, and they're very similar to the United States Constitution, but they're not exactly identical. And actually, what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did in the end was to make a determination that it violated the free and equal clause, election clause of the Pennsylvania Constitution, which Actually, the Pennsylvania Constitution, its Declaration of Rights, was what they call it, the ancestor, not the offspring of the United States Constitution. That's what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said. Excuse me. But it has a lot of the same requirements as the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, and that's how it's been construed by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court generally. And they found that the way that they'd drawn the lines in Pennsylvania was ridiculous and violated the free and equal clause of the Pennsylvania Constitution. And it's because it's based purely on state law, it's the decision of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has, in my view, and so far, has a pretty good chance of just hanging in there without the Supreme Court of the United States changing it, no matter what happens in the United States Supreme Court cases. The other ones, excuse me, and it's currently Michael kind of described what's going on with it, but they've tried. The last thing that happened, and we're talking about just like last week, the Democrats. No, okay, I get confused about who's who. But anyway, the Democrats, yeah. No, I'm sorry, the Republicans, the people that were trying to move the case and get it stayed in the United States Supreme Court, file another appeal to try to get the Supreme Court to stay it. And Justice Alito had already denied one stay, that hasn't been decided by the Supreme Court yet. But they keep trying to stay the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, and so far they haven't been able to do that on federal grounds. So that's basically, yeah.
Their reason for staying it is they're arguing that the Constitution grants the power to draw districts to the legislature, and that the court, Pennsylvania State Court, has violated that part of our Constitution, the federal Constitution, by drawing the lines.
But in the 2015 case for Arizona, because Arizona, the legislature also brought a case against the Independent Redistricting Commission they formed there. That also went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled that yes, you can have an Independent Redistricting Commission, and yes, citizens can sit on it because they are, in effect, acting on behalf of the legislature or on behalf of the people. So.
And courts change things all the time. I mean, I think that's a difficult argument, but I mean, yeah, you're right. That's the argument that they're making.
Yeah.
We'll take whatever we can get.
Yeah, that's what they're trying to do. But so far, the state of Pennsylvania needs to redo its maps, and the court has come up with an alternative, and they're trying their best to get out of it. The Republicans are, but haven't been successful so far. All right, I think that's
Thanks, David.
pretty much where it stands.
So we're going to open it up to questions in a moment here. For a while, we'll always try to end a little bit early so you can come up and address the panel members individually. It's always a good time for discussion. As usual, we'll call on people, ask a brief question. We're going to allow one follow-up question. What we're trying to avoid is people getting into a back and forth argument with one of the panel members, because that's just not fair to the rest of the audience. But as we start here, being the moderator, I get to have the first question. And I'm going to make this a general question to the entire panel. So Texas is going to redraw the districts in 2021 with the legislature at that time. There's lots of things happening, political scene, ways to evaluate what they draw, lots of things happening on the court scene. What are the things that might be happening in 2021 that we can look for that'll make this a less gerrymandered result? What do we have to look for?
I think it's going to be worse. So I don't know if you guys saw yesterday, but there was an article in the Tribune. There is an article. I think it's going to be worse in 2021. Unless the efficiency gap case comes down in favor of getting rid of a certain amount of partisan gerrymandering, which hopefully will be the case. But if not, then it's going to be worse in 2021. In the Texas Tribune yesterday, there was an article that described a new super PAC that was formed with the help of Governor Abbott and they are going, it's called, what is it, Project Red Texas, I think?
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so it's exactly the opposite of what we need. We need less partisan gerrymandering, not more. So
And they have a
just-
huge bankroll of like 500 grand so far.
But it's all
That's
from
what
one
they are.
donor. And I just want to point out that our group that we've assembled is bigger. We have more people. We have more voting rights groups that have full-time salaries as well. So we're here and we're going to be fighting back.
What happens if one of the Supreme Court decisions goes in a positive direction? How does that affect Texas?
You know, I think because Texas is sort of complicated from a partisan gerrymandering standpoint, I don't know that I'm not sure how difficult it will be to prove that it constitutes. I mean, Michael, I think if I understood you to say earlier that the efficiency gap you computed in Texas was 9%. And that's below slightly the typical threshold that's considered an extreme gerrymander?
No, it's quite a bit above.
Is it above what? Okay.
7% is kind of the line that says if you're above 7%, then you will not flip the state in the duration of the census period.
So I think one of the things you also have to keep in mind, though, is you can't just simply calculate it for 1 year, right? One election cycle. You have to have 3 election cycles in order to prove that there was consistent, lasting damage. So now that's why we didn't see this measure come out until after the 2016 election. So.
Yeah, without Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, it is exceedingly painful to remedy any of these things. And so even if Gil v. Whitford comes back, I'd say 2021 in Texas will be horribly gerrymandered, and we'll have to fight it in 2026 or whatever.
So that's.
I have a little understanding. This could be my misunderstanding about the 7.5% thing. I mean that's like it's like a 75% predictability for that. Is that right? Or I shouldn't be.
I'm not sure exactly.
But I think it also varies statistically over different types of states, and for the type of state Texas is, it might be slightly different. My impression was just, and you're a better expert at this than I am, but I think there's a possibility it might be difficult to argue that it's about partisan gerrymandering in Texas. But I think it would be helpful. And for one thing, I'm hopeful that our Fair Maps group can argue that that's a reason for reform and the reforms that we're pushing as far as an independent redistricting commission and so forth. And I think it will provide us that opportunity.
Yeah, I do not have high hope that I could go to their board meeting where they show off their maps and analyze them in front of them and say, look at what you're doing, and have them respond positively.
I think it's important, though, to go on record. Unfortunately, that's the case, so we have to be not proactive but reactive. So we need to be providing testimony. So when the maps do get through and get accepted, we then have evidence for the court cases that are to follow, basically. And then another important thing that I wanted to mention, I thought it was up here, the Perez trial, the Texas gerrymandering case that's going to be heard before the Supreme Court. We've had so many problems with voting rights here in Texas, and now that Shelby County versus Holder went through, they trashed preclearance. So we've had so many hits against us that if they do find that the state was guilty of racial gerrymandering, there is a very, very good chance that the whole state will go back under preclearance. So we can be very hopeful for that.
Yeah, that would be extremely helpful if they did that. And I think the district court would be prepared to do that. It's just a question of whether the United States Supreme Court will include that as part of its decision, the chance to do that.
Okay, ready to open up the audience.
What is the process for filling the position of a nonpartisan commission? I mean, we are so partisan in this state. How do you effectively find people that are down the middle, that can be trusted to be a nonpartisan commission? And who selects them? How do they do it?
Go ahead.
There's your expert right there.
I love that question because I'm one of the 14 commissioners on Austin's Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, and the selection process fascinated me. It was based on what California had done, and the league Francis McIntyre, went all around and attended every one of the meetings that was set up all over the city to encourage people to apply for the commission. And they were so successful, they got 544 applications for a 14-member panel. And the application form was brilliantly done. I'm presuming that was also modeled on California. They asked you a whole bunch of questions. They asked questions to weed out people who had connections to the existing city council or who had, you know, sold goods or services to the city. I mean, they did a lot of smart stuff. And then they had CPAs boil down the 544 to what they considered the best 60. And then they did one of these Super Bowl lottery things where they pulled the first 8 out of, you know, I mean, it was really almost amusing. And then those 8 chose the remaining 6 panelist commissioners from the 52 left to reflect the diversity requirements in our charter. Consequently, we got a 14-panel commission that looked like Austin. Not just 7 men and 7 women, but you know, ethnic groups, racial groups. The youngest was 22 because there was a student required, a student commissioner. He was excellent. And the oldest was like 72. So there was a 50. I mean, there were all religious or all political types, you know, according to, you know, were you Democrat or Republican or whatever. And I have never worked with a group that I had such admiration for. So, in my opinion, the system really worked. And as our 2 lawyers told us, it really worked because your map didn't get sued. The map that we produced didn't get sued, and I think was fairly popular. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yak.
Excellent.
And if I remember correctly, there were applications for 2 different positions. One was for the legal aspect, and another was for a Citizens Redistricting Commission. So there were, if you had legal expertise, you applied for so that you could oversee what the Citizens Redistricting Board was doing. And that was an application process as well.
So also on the design, usually what you see, like in California, they have 5 Democrats, 5 Republican, 4 independents. In Arizona, it's a little different. So in the words of Gary Bledsoe, the president of the NAACP, the devil is in the details. So in some of these groups, you do question partisan intent, and unfortunately, like I mentioned, partisan intent often infringes on racial gerrymandering as well, or racial minority groups' rights. So the design of the commission is very important. And that's one of the challenges that we were having here in Texas, is a lot of the voting rights groups don't actually want to get on board because of past experiences that they've seen in Arizona and California and stuff like that. So we're hoping, the Fair Maps group, we're talking about getting everyone at the table, and we would like to just start discussions, like if we have a citizens commission, could we have an advisory commission with legal expert help, or an academic group that points us in the right direction, and then start talking about reform and also drawing maps that we can provide for record. So yeah, anyway, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Dan.
I want to ask about something Michael said, but I'd be happy to hear from anybody with an opinion. You said that you prefer competitiveness over accurate representation. It's not quite clear to me why. I mean,
not me personally. Well, I do, but the reason why is because it goes back to wanting to have a voice and having your vote be able to change things. And so if you live in a place where there's like, you have to change the vote outcome by 6% to kick somebody out of office, right? That is effectively never going to kick that person out of office. Whereas if your slope of your line is a whole lot sharper, and in order to get that outcome, you don't have to go 6%, you only have to go 2%. That's a lot easier to say, well, okay, you make me mad, I'm going to vote against you, you're out of office. And that's why I like it.
But if you're seating a representative assembly, the better the representation, the better governance, theoretically.
Yeah, well, to some extent. And also that plot is way, way, way too simple, right? Because it is only split by two parties. It doesn't respect community of interest. It doesn't respect the incredible multivariate space that is there. So do I prefer competitive elections for political parties? Yeah, absolutely. That's easy to say. Do I prefer it for the multivariate space? No. In that space, I really want representation.
Thank you. Next question.
And the constitutional requirement is not for competitiveness, it's for representation.
Well, I just want to, I have a general question I want to ask, but I want
Can you
to,
make it louder so people in the back can
I
hear?
want to know a methodological question first. Everything that you've done there looks to be Gaussian. Is there no Bayesian or even a fractal analysis here that gives you a better predictability, since we're talking about, throwing away, efficiency?
Is. I am actually not the mathematician in the group. I'm the code monkey.
Okay.
I'm the one, they come up with their ideas and they write some horrible code, and I'm the one who makes it run on, 100 computers at once, and yeah.
Okay. So my general question is, well, actually there's a couple, but we're having a situation where you have a structural functional relationship between the federal government and the state government. And by the Constitution, we have the states drawing the districts. But they're drawing the districts not only for the legislature, the state legislature, but for the federal representation. So I'm kind of curious, and that's kind of a messy relationship, and I'm kind of curious how well we've actually defined that, and what the legal precedent is for controlling that, and what the outcomes are, because what functionally and structurally actually happens in a voter system with millions of people voting in it, and what the actual legal structures that we end up with are probably wildly disconnected. And it seems like we really don't have a clear handle on establishing that relationship or any criteria for dealing with it. So I'm kind of curious what anybody else would think.
Well, Article 1 of the Constitution gives it to the legislatures, although there's the case that Stephanie mentioned, the Arizona independent redistricting case that was decided a couple years ago, 2015. There's a case involving an independent redistricting commission in Arizona, and the legislature in Arizona actually objected to the independent redistricting commission, and the Supreme Court said no, it's okay, because the people in the state voted to have an independent redistricting commission, and that was controlling, and they were permitted to draw lines based on that. So, it's kind of worked out, but there's.
But in Texas, obviously, both systems are being hit now.
So in the state constitution, there's no requirement for federal congressional districts. There are certain requirements for the state house and the state senate.
Sure.
I think each state is different though. And so there's no way, there hasn't been a way yet for the U.S. Supreme Court or anyone to dictate how that looks. That's why you have all these cases going to the Supreme Court on, anyways, yeah.
I just think that's like the ship has sailed.
Yeah.
Right, it's in our Constitution, it's what we have to work with, and we need to optimize within that framework, because we can't rewrite the Constitution to do this in a different way.
Well, that's kind of what I'm asking.
Well, you have one.
How do we deal with it?
Okay, other questions? Maybe. Go ahead.
Since gerrymandering has been around in America for over 200 years, and I'm sensing a real swelling of interest in the topic, is that because it's gotten so egregious, or is it because of computers? or another reason?
Both. Like, it's gotten worse. It's gotten more egregious. I think Stephanie would say that we've had the tools for quite a while, but what we've lacked, we had the tools back in the 90s to do it like on a block level. What we did not have was the precision of data to say who was going to vote which way in that block level. So now we have social networks. We've got just this fire hose of data. You've got Cambridge Analytica. You can just go and pay money to say, tell me about this person. And you learn way, way, way more than you ever thought you would or should. And that enables people to draw those lines with incredible precision. Now, you also, thankfully, have computers that are able to detect it, right? And to show it and say, this is the outcome of doing it that way. Because just pointing out a strange shape, like I said, is not a strong enough argument. But when you can say, look, they've drawn this shape, it has this demographic outcome, which changes this statistic, that statistic is one that is against the rules, throw it out.
I think also after the Republicans got a beating when Obama was elected, they lost everything basically in 2008. There were a few key Republican strategists who realized, hey, we can gerrymander the crap out of the House and win back some leverage. So they started a group called Project Red Map, and they really, really heavily gerrymandered a lot of the states. So I think right now we're experiencing the backlash to that project as well, because there is a very large disadvantage in a lot of states, Texas being one of them.
And having Eric Holder behind
The Democratic response now.
Changing, redistricting, I think, helps at a higher level. And so you see it now trickling down from that to the state level.
But it's the data.
It's the answer to Red Map.
I mean, they're just able to do it. And so if they can get away with it, they do, because they want to win.
And if you're
that's
curious
the bottom line.
about Red Map, the best book that's been out recently is called Rat Rock. And it tells you the whole history of how Red Map occurred and continues to occur.
Author is David Daly.
Yeah, David Daly.
And that's really why the court, hopefully, is really seriously looking at this issue of establishing a standard for partisan gerrymandering. I mean, it's really evident that it can be done very effectively.
Anybody want to say more about what Eric Holder's doing?
Well, let's see, I'm not sure that I can say much more.
Blue Map.
Maybe, I don't know, Stephanie, can you
Sure.
expand on the national push?
I think the group is called, well, it was called Advantage 2020, but I think it's something different now. At any rate, I think they've raised 21 million, maybe 19 million in funds, and they plan to just fund candidates. They're going to go to swing states. I think in Texas, they're going to help. In Texas, for our state legislator, we're short, I think, 2 seats to give us some rule, some standing where we can argue more bills on the floor. So they're going to come in and help fundraises. But importantly, overall for the U.S., they're going to go to swing states. And what they want to do is they want Democrats to be in charge at the next census time, basically. So Democrats are in charge of the redistricting process. Oh.
And that's not going to be any better than it depends on your political persuasion, right? However, right, if you're a nonpartisan, non-profit organization, you don't want either one of them regulating their districts and picking their voters rather than the voters picking their representatives. And that's the one person, one vote issue, and do all of our voices get it, regardless of who we are.
Yeah.
If you want to indulge in a little bit of blue sky thinking, we're all very used to the idea that each representative represents a district. If we were to go to, say, ranked choice voting and multi-member districts, what effect do you think that would have on gerrymandering, on the payoff from gerrymandering?
You're going to have to believe this is a discussion about gerrymandering. We have multi-party districts.
Dan in the back is a big proponent.
Yeah.
He can tell us much more about multi-member districts.
Yeah, it lowers the incentives because it's not as profitable to gerrymander when you have multi-member districts.
Absolutely.
But I learned something really interesting and new to me, and I'm going to put it up on the Common Ground website. That the Oscars are coming out on Sunday, and the way they determine the winner of the Best Picture is by ranked choice voting.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Isn't it interesting? I'm going to put that up on our website. It's amazing.
I think it's all the categories, is it not?
No,
Oh.
not all the categories, just that one.
I
Just
am
that
a
one.
big proponent of it. I think it's a fantastic idea. I think we need more entry points for other parties, and I think we also need top 4 nonpartisan primaries. I think we need to be mixing it up to give more people a voice and to make it more of an equal ground and less partisan. So I think it's a fantastic idea.
I will say it'll make the math a lot harder, but that's a good problem to have.
That's what these are for.
Right.
Have you all heard of the star vote system? It's a preference rather than ranked choice. It's a preference system where you simply assign points to candidates the way you would assign points to a book at Amazon, for example. There are a bunch of books. And it's combined with an instant runoff, so you don't have any second election to choose the final winner. And it's being tried out in a couple of districts in Oregon. It's called STAR, S-T-A-R, for, what does it mean?
Score.
1 through 5 stars?
Yes, no, score, then automatic runoff.
It's an automatic runoff. I have questions about how that affects the racial minorities and their ability to be represented. And it's maybe just because I don't really understand it that clearly. But I think there's some concerns there.
With ranked choice voting, though, it's supposed to actually give minority groups a better chance of representation.
Right.
And so Moon Duchan, she was pulled in as an expert witness in Santa Clara to determine if they had enough of a minority population to have single-member districts. And ultimately what she recommended was you probably don't, but if you use something like single transferable vote, then you would have more representation likely. She said likely though, because there just isn't data on it.
Yeah, that's true. There's no
So the other piece of trivia that I have is that I'm reading the autobiography of Katharine Graham. And if we think that
That's a story.
money in politics is the issue of today, in 1957, Phil Graham wrote a piece on the use of money to influence politics. So we've been doing this for a long, long time.
He's an economist from A&M.
Do we have any other audience questions from whoever hasn't asked one yet? Okay, you get your second.
So, should we try to set up an initiative for the coming legislature to get an amendment to allow referendum in this state? Is that worth pursuing?
It kind of scares me, right? Like we would maybe get what we want, but there's a lot of extreme ideas I think in this state, and I read a lot of them to gerrymandering actually and the polarization of our parties, but it would concern me that we would open up a can of worms and
We'd just deadlock everything.
Yeah.
Or it might blow up in our face and people get railroaded into something we really don't want.
Yeah.
Happened in California.
We could repeal the Red Texas Railroad Commission.
So let me ask one final question for the group, and this may be mainly for Stephanie. What would you ask people to do for the next? Yeah.
We're going to have our toolkit up, but I think what we're leaning on is we need people to get local resolutions passed, and we need people to become familiar with the mapping process. We'd like to hear your input. We're trying to form an advisory board that will hopefully have people like the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and we will be generating maps to your input on what you think the map should look like. And then there's always just the general stuff. Contact your legislator, let them know that you care about redistricting and stuff like that.
And I'll put a plug in for the census, because if we don't have an accurate census, we will not have good district.
So we need volunteers to go work for the census, right?
Not 100% sure exactly what's going to happen yet. March 31st is when they will be deciding on the final form of the list of questions that can be asked. There's one question that we're all concerned about, obviously.
Of course.
But March 31st, they will then codify what the questions will be. And I have a report that I'm about ready to put up on the Common Ground website from the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau lists all of the potential difficulties and how they intend to address them. It will be interesting to see how it comes about. So it's fascinating that certain parts of the government are very aware of the problems that they are about to step into. But there are other parts of the government that don't care. Right? So one of the reasons for doing the Census 2020 workshop is to get the Asian American community, the African American community, the Hispanic community, the community of young people that have, or older people for that matter, that have grandchildren or children who are under 5. Right? They are residents and they need to have their census questionnaire filled out for them. Right? So there are a whole lot of underrepresented groups or undercounted groups and how to go about tackling them. And I think one of the recommendations that has been made is that you find the leaders of organizations that talk to, on a daily basis, these groups of people. And there are several of them. So we're going to try to get everybody together.
I have 2 more requests since it's primary season right now and we're going to be having an election. Well, not only go vote, but ask your candidates. What do you think about redistricting reform? If you support it, why? If not, why? Also, what type of legislation would you like to see them support as well? So make sure they know about it and that it's on their radar. Another thing is, if anybody would like to present or talk to local community groups, please come see us because we can help you set up presentations, small talks. We'll have scripts ready. So please, if anyone would like to volunteer, please come see us afterwards.
Yeah, we're all in different groups, right? So just make sure that you cross-pollinate and spread this information and go talk to many, many people.
Which one of you would be Common Cause when I talk to
he's not, unfortunately, he was committed today, so he wasn't here, but Anthony Gutierrez with Common Cause is the person local.
Here in Austin.
He's in Austin, but he's the CEO of the Texas group.
Just on an informational and resource sharing piece, heard about your guideline from the Austin Redistricting and these other events. Can there be sort of a combined sharing of what's coming up and what's needed, so that both calendar, resource page for links.
So go to the Fair Maps. I was thinking about that on the way over because I've been to we had a census event last week and we have another event after this event today. So I'm going to make a calendar and list them. It'll be on the Fair Maps website and it'll be under news, and then you can go there and access all of this information.
Well, and then hopefully resource.
And the guide is actually, the guide will be found in various places. So Common Ground for Texans has the guide on his website and a link. So, and we probably should end up having a repository of resources of all of these. Brennan Center is also an excellent source of information on the census, on redistricting, on election reform, on different election systems. So there are
there's a long list of things that they're doing.
Yes, there's a long list of things that they're doing.
You know, one thing I'd say is, I think here in Austin, because of this lady right here and then the Independent Redistricting Commission that we had here in Austin, I think you all are in a unique position to maybe be persuasive to people about that issue and about how it can work. And I just would encourage you to do as much as you can. Plus you're here in Austin, which makes it a little easier to get to the legislature and so forth, obviously.
We had the idea of trying to convince other cities, and that was Harriet's idea as well, to set up an independent redistricting commission. I found it very difficult to start something like that. Local communities get a little peeved when I come in and say, hey, you guys should consider this, because they kind of view me as an outsider, even though I might have grown up like 15 minutes away. So that's one idea. So if you guys have friends, and then again, just the importance of talking to the community and your neighbors, so these ideas are passed so people know that they exist, basically.
And David, you want to plug clean elections?
Well, clean elections, I mean, redistricting is one of the things we do, but we're really more focused on campaign finance reform issues. And we work a lot on, and actually intend to have legislation again this next session on some sort of public financing option for elections, and then also contribution limits. We probably will have a separate contribution limits bill that will promote, because I don't know if you all know or not, but in Texas there's no limit on the amount of contributions you can give directly to candidates here, which is pretty amazing thing.
Judges.
Except for judges, and so consequently, I mean, huge amounts of money. I mean, the governor got like $400,000 from one gentleman up in Dallas. Just wrote him 2 different checks for $200 grand. That was in his election cycle in 2014. So I mean, there's issues about contribution limits that I think are real important, and I'm a little hopeful that might go. So the public financing aspect and small donor financing of elections is something that we're interested in, and it takes place a lot in other jurisdictions, but that's probably a longer shot.
I'd like to point out that getting the Austin Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, that its creation was a bipartisan effort here in Austin. There was an enormous amount of work to get it on the ballot, and there were 7 groups that worked. I mean, there were 30 groups total, but 7 of those 30 had the name Democratic or Republican in them. The 2 parties worked together, and in this era of hyper-partisanship, it's wonderful when that can occur, and it occurred here in Austin to the betterment of Austin. So that, to me, is part of the sales pitch.
So I think both, like I think the Democrats wanted to help the voting rights groups, so we'd have single-member districts. So that's why they were on board, and conservatives felt like it would give them a better opportunity because Austin is very liberal.
That's
so
right.
It worked out very well.
Yeah,
I wish the whole state was like that. That's also what happened in California as well, I believe. There was conservatives that were driving the driving force behind the IRC out there.
Yeah. Well, Schwarzenegger, I mean, he was a Republican governor, right?
Yes.
And I understand he was kind of instrumental in getting that.
Yeah. I think he's the one that found the funding for it. He went to a conservative, I'm not sure, I don't remember if it was a university or someone that was associated with the university, I think, that actually funded it.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to reach out to the business community. I mean, Stephanie's said some things, and I mean, we're trying to make contacts with people that might have some influence on the Republican side.
Yeah, great.
And I mean, we acknowledge that that's something that we ought to be doing.
Okay, so we always like to leave a little bit of time at the end for people to come up and individually talk with panel members. Before we do that, I want to thank the folks who showed up. Michael, Stephanie, David, Joanne.
And as always, there's coffee and cookies in the back.
And I want to thank you folks for coming here. There's many things you could be doing this afternoon, but you may coming here to be informed of your key choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those of you who are able, please help us stack up the chairs afterwards. Come and talk to the panel members, enjoy the coffee and refreshments in the back. Thank you very much for coming.